Good evening. Can you hear me okay? Tonight our speaker is Nick Sikorsky. Nick is a native of Redwood City, a graduate of San Jose State University, where he earned a BA in history and a master's degree in library and information science. From 2008 to just recently, he was the assistant archivist for exhibits at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. He is currently pursuing a PhD at the Institute of History of the Polish Academy of Sciences in Warsaw, Poland. He's writing a dissertation on Herbert Hoover and the American Relief Administration in Poland from 1919 to 1922. He lived in Poland in the early 1990s and visited numerous times, and now resides in Warsaw, where he spent most of this year. His website is researchteacher.com, and he's going to talk to us today about Poland Today. Nicholas Sikorsky.
Thank you very much, George. It's very nice to be here again. This is my second time. I was here a few years ago, so I'm very happy to be here again. And I've met a number of the residents a few times who've come to visit Hoover. Is that okay in the back? Can you hear me now? All right, it's like the Sprint commercial, right? Can you hear me now? All right, so the subject of my talk is Poland Today. So naturally, since Poland has been a part of my life for my entire life, and Poland has a very rich history. History is a natural component of Poland's present and future as far as its identity goes. So Poland Today, I came a long way to give this talk, actually. 5,870 miles from Warsaw. I'm back here for the holidays. I'm studying now in Warsaw. Warsaw is the birthplace of my mother. Both of my parents came from Poland. My mom from Warsaw and my dad from Poznań, which is in the west of Poland, not far from Berlin, actually, close to the western border of the country. Unfortunately, there isn't a direct flight from Warsaw to Redwood City or San Francisco. I have to go through Frankfurt or Zurich, Switzerland, as was the case this time. Showing you a little bit of my roots here. This is back in 1992. I'm the one here with a tie. I forgot my tie today. With my sister and brother. This is back when my father, Dr. Maciej Siekierski, was head of the Hoover Institution office in Warsaw, collecting historical documentation right after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain. So for almost 2 years, our family lived in Warsaw, actually in that building right behind us, for that period of time when my father was working there. So I've had the chance to see the dramatic transition that Poland has gone through in the last 25 years. This year is the 25th anniversary of Poland having its first free elections back in June of 1989. Just a quick rundown of the history of Poland. Back over 1,000 years ago is when Poland's written history starts, when the Polish king accepted Christianity. The height of the Polish Empire was, I don't know if you'd call it an empire, but just a huge kingdom, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth from 1569 to 1772. The key date in that is September 11, 1683. So this is a different September 11th when King Jan Sobieski helped defend the city of Vienna from the Ottoman Turks when they were invading Europe at that point. Unfortunately, Poland went through a period of decline, and it was partitioned by its neighbors, the Russians, Prussians, and Austro-Hungarian Empire. So by the end of 1775, Poland ceased to exist on the map. In November of 1918, Poland regained its independence after over 100 years of not being in existence. And then there was what was known as the interwar period, about 20 years of relative peace when Poland rebuilt itself. And then unfortunately, again, war in September of 1939. Poland finally regained its independence in June of 1989, just over 25 years ago, when the Solidarity Trade Union, which became a countrywide political movement, won the first free elections there. In 1999, Poland joined NATO, so it's been 15 years already. And in 2004, Poland joins the European Union, which has been a huge benefit to the country's economy, and also helped Poles who wanted to emigrate beyond the country to find work elsewhere, especially places like England, Ireland, Norway. A few maps here to show what kind of territory Poland had back in 1619. This was the height of its territory. You can see that Poland covered most of what's present-day Ukraine, all of Belarus, the Baltics, and this is modern-day Poland, is this outline here. The partitions and the various empires that took Poland over. So it was a gradual process over about 20 years, but in the end, nothing was left, though the Polish culture, language was in the hearts and minds of the people. So they kept it for over a century before they regained physical independence. And then Poland in the interwar period. You can see that the borders were dramatically further to the east. After World War II, Poland's borders were shifted to the west, and the cities of Vilnius, or Vilno in Polish, and Lvov, or Lviv in Ukrainian, were on one hand given over to the Lithuanians, and Lvov handed over to the Ukrainians. So it's a dramatic change for Poland, since these were two historic cities and areas, and basically half the country was shifted over to the west. As a brief aside, George mentioned that I'm doing my research on Herbert Hoover and the American Relief Administration. This was basically like a Marshall Plan type endeavor, except it was after World War I. It was America's way of rebuilding Europe after the war, and there was a special focus on Poland as being a kind of bulwark between Bolshevik Russia and Western Europe. Here we have a picture in downtown Warsaw where they were actually celebrating the 4th of July. It was July 4th, 1921, thanking America for all the aid that had been given to Poland. And there you have an improvised Statue of Liberty. This is the National Theater. So this is the main balcony of the National Theater. And here you have people with American flags, so it was a very big celebration. Another element of this aid to Poland was American pilots who went to go fight on behalf of Poland in 1920, known as the Kościuszko Squadron. Kościuszko was a Polish patriot and leader who helped General George Washington as part of his general staff during the Revolutionary War, and this was kind of reciprocation when American pilots finally came over to help the Poles fighting against the Bolsheviks. This is a statue of gratitude to American pilots in the cemetery in Lviv. So this is now Ukraine, but there's still the Polish, strong Polish element in the city of Lviv. Poland, as it was during World War II, it was divided between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. The central part of the country was known as the General Government. And of course, Poland was the territory where the Holocaust occurred. About 6 million Polish citizens lost their lives over the course of the war. So it's over 20% of the Polish population was lost in that 6-year period. And here we have Poland in its present borders. You can see that Lviv is no longer a part of it, and Vilnius even further off, and everything was shifted further over to the west. Warsaw is the capital of Poland. It's the largest city. 1.7 million people live there. And that's where I currently reside. And I mentioned also my father, who's from Poznan. So a few things about the Polish economy. The Polish economy was the one place in all of Europe that had a positive growth rate throughout the financial crisis. There's this phrase called the Green Island, which was describing basically Poland's situation in that period. You can see that the dominating part of the economy is services, followed by industry, and then agriculture. GDP per capita is around $21,000, and national debt around $362 billion. Unemployment is officially around 10%, but this number is a bit skewed by the huge number of Poles who have emigrated, mostly to other EU countries to find work. So if these 2 million people were back in Poland, the unemployment rate might actually be closer to 20%. So that's been a big blessing to be a part of the EU and be able to find work when people can't find it in the country. The currency is the zloty. It's roughly 3.34 zloty to $1. And there's talk about transitioning over to the euro, but given the instability in Europe over the last 5 years or so, I think the Poles are going to hold off on that for a while. Gas prices in Poland. It's, if you do the math, so this is in liters, and if you do the math for gallons, it works out to about $6 a gallon. I think it's probably gone down a little bit in the last few months, but that's about what people pay. So you see a lot more economy cars in Poland, and gas is definitely at a premium compared to this. I guess I've heard this somewhere in the Midwest, it was $2 a gallon, so it's changed a lot here. Poland it's a modern economy. It's not at the same level, quite level as Western Europe, but you have stores like this. This is the British chain Tesco, so it's about as big as our Costco, and it's you can buy just about everything that you need. Another element, though, here you have these votive candles. All Saints' Day is very big in Poland. Here, Halloween, I think, is much more popular, but in Poland, All Saints' Day is the day when Poles go to visit the graves of their ancestors, and they'll clean the grave, and they'll bring votive candles like these. So you can see they have huge sales and deals on votive candles that you can buy in bulk. Kind of transitioning to the major event in Polish 21st century history, and perhaps the biggest event since the end of World War II, was the Smoleńsk tragedy, which was April 10th of 2010. So almost 5 years ago, when the Polish presidential plane crashed just outside the airport of Smoleńsk, Russia. The additional tragedy to this disaster, which claimed the lives of the Polish president, his wife, the main chiefs of staff, prominent political leaders throughout the country, was that they were on their way to the Katyn forest, where in 1940 about 8,000 Polish officers were killed by the Soviet NKVD as part of their ethnic cleansing of eastern Poland, and also their way of trying to liquidate the Polish elite. So this was a double tragedy that has yet to be resolved as far as the exact causes of the crash. So the official report was that the plane's wing clipped a tree and was severed, and then went to a tailspin and then crashed. But there's a lot of conflicting studies and scientific studies that have been done that cast a lot of doubt on the official report that's been released by the Polish government. And while I don't have an opinion either way, based on what I've seen and learned, that there's still a lot of questions that remain to be answered. There's a physics professor who is at the University of Akron, Ohio, who is of Polish descent. He's done studies using complex simulations. Based on his studies, he doesn't think it's possible that the plane would have broken apart into so many pieces across such a wide area without explosions occurring. So there's no way he thinks that it could have crashed into the ground. This disaster has been the basis for a lot of friction within Polish society. The president has a twin brother he was the prime minister at this time, and he is the leader of the opposition party in Poland. There's the Civic Platform, which is the current governing party, and the Law and Justice Party, which his brother now controls. So there's been a lot of friction over the last 4 years, and basically this tragedy is what set off that friction. Poland's been a member of NATO for 15 years. Close to 2% of its GDP is spent on the military, and I believe that's one of the highest ratios in all of Europe. And over 4,000 troops also served in Iraq and Afghanistan. Poland has the largest tank force in Europe, although many of those tanks are Soviet-era tanks, though they have purchased 128 modern Leopard tanks from Germany. So especially in the past few years, Poland has taken a lot of initiative to increase its military spending. although it's not self-sufficient in that regard, especially when it comes to potential conflict with Russia. Poland's main reliance is on NATO and essentially U.S. forces for assistance in that need. Here we have pictures of a few of the new tanks. Poland's national military holiday is in August, which celebrates the victory of the Polish army over the Red Army on the outskirts of Warsaw in 1920. There was the Polish-Soviet War of 1920, and in that war, the Poles were able to defeat the Red Army just outside of Warsaw. So every year on this day, there's usually a military parade along with aerial flyovers, and it was especially symbolic this year because of the conflict in Ukraine, and it was a way of showing that Poland was investing in its military. Another view of the tanks. This is a picture from the day that President Obama visited Warsaw back in June, and this segues into the subject of Russia, Ukraine, and NATO. As I mentioned, Poland is highly dependent on NATO for its protection. It's done all this military spending as a way to show that it's invested into the alliance, but definitely American support is the primary thing that Poles need to feel safe, especially when it comes with relations with Russia. Here we see some Ukrainian flags, since that was and it still is an ongoing subject. And here we have President Obama on a screen. This was in Warsaw's Old Town, so not far from the downtown. And there were a lot of people. I managed to get relatively close. Here we have President Obama behind a bulletproof screen there. I think he was looking right at me, so he gave me a good shot. I have a friend who is an artist, and he specializes in political posters, so I have a selection of some of the posters that he came up with, especially relating to Putin. This one is quite interesting, and it kind of shows a bit more about the tense political situation in Poland, where actually someone complained to a district prosecutor about him using the SS letters, as in the Nazi SS, accusing him of somehow promoting fascism for doing that, even though obviously he's not promoting fascism here. Raz is the word once in Polish, so once Lenin, once Stalin, and then raz Putin. So a play on words there. In the East without changes is what the Bible reads. Another quite graphic one here. As I mentioned, history is a key part of Poland's present, not just its past. I am a volunteer at the Warsaw Uprising Museum, which is one of the largest museums in Poland, and it focuses on the Warsaw Uprising, which was the Polish underground home army's attempt to reclaim Warsaw in August of 1944 before the Red Army arrived. So it was their 2-month battle against the Nazis. They thought it would only last a few days. It ended up being 2 months, and it was ultimately unsuccessful. Over 200,000 Poles perished in this battle. But as a way of commemorating the struggle and the resilience and desire to be free that the Poles showed, the Warsaw Uprising Museum was created, actually founded by Lech Kaczynski, the Polish president who died in the Smoleńsk crash. When he was president, or then mayor and president are the same when it comes to the chief executive of Warsaw, the city of Warsaw. Here we have a view of the Post building. This was once the tallest building in Warsaw, the center of the telephone exchange, built during the Russian Tsarist times, when that part of Poland was under Russian occupation. And here's the building today with the PW, Polska Walcząca, fighting Poland. That was kind of the underground symbol of the resistance to the Nazis. So that memory is still there today. Another picture from the uprising. and kind of a juxtaposition here of one of Warsaw's main streets, Khmelna Street. I just live a few blocks from here, with a picture from August of 1944, juxtaposing the two together. This past August was the 70th anniversary of the outbreak of the Warsaw Uprising, so there were many events involved with commemorating that struggle. There are memorial tablets like this throughout Warsaw, talking about battles that occurred in a certain place, and also tragically the number of people that were killed in this place or that place, not just during the Warsaw Uprising, but during the German occupation between 1939 and 1944. And people are very good still about bringing flowers and candles and that type of thing. So Warsaw is deeply saturated with history. As a volunteer at the museum, I had the amazing opportunity to do some work for the Archive of Oral History. They've done over 400 interviews with different people who participated in the Warsaw Uprising or survived it. And given the fact that I was of American background and know English relatively well, then I came to help in this interview and one other with John Toft. He was the captain of a Halifax plane that flew from southern Italy to Warsaw in August of 1944 to drop supplies for the Polish Home Army to help them during their fight. That was another factor in World War II history where the Soviet Union, even though they were technically allied with the West by the end of the war, they did not allow Allied planes to fly with supplies to drop over Warsaw and then to land on Soviet-controlled airfields. So these Allied crews had to fly all the way from southern Italy to Warsaw, make their drop, and then fly back, mostly over enemy-held territory. I don't remember the exact length of the flight, but I believe it was around 17 or 18 hours at night over enemy-controlled territory. So John Toft was actually in Warsaw. He lives in England now, but he was back for the first time since 1944. So he was amazed to see the changes that had occurred in the city and the warm reception that he received. Here's a Halifax. So he was the captain. I also had a chance to interview the tail gunner and another member of the crew, the navigator. So these are the three of them at their hotel the morning before they left to go back to England, and where I also conducted one more interview. And I also had a chance to handle some of the weaponry in the armory of the Uprising Museum. They have a large armory where they had weapons, not just from the Uprising, but just representative of what the Polish underground was using at the time. This is a Tommy gun, so it was probably dropped by parachute into Warsaw during the fight. At the end of World War II, the struggle wasn't over for many thousands of Polish Home Army soldiers. There were hundreds and thousands of Polish soldiers who had fought against the Nazis but were now persecuted by the communist authorities that had taken over Poland. They were known later in history as the cursed soldiers, since their struggle essentially had been lost. The Allies had finished their operations and they weren't about to go to war with the Soviet Union, even though it was clear that the Cold War was just starting to develop. Many of these soldiers were imprisoned, interrogated, tortured, and ultimately killed, and buried in unmarked graves throughout the country. There's been an attempt finally in the last 2 years to exhume many of these sites and recover the remains of these Polish patriots and heroes to try to bring back that memory of what they sacrificed for. One person whose remains were recently found was Warsaw Uprising, who had a very, very colorful career. He worked in the Polish border guard in the 1920s, and he was, I'll just relate one anecdote, which relates sort of to something that happened a few months ago. You'll recall that an Estonian border guard was kidnapped by Russian border guards on the opposite side. I'm not sure how it was exactly resolved, but something similar happened in the 1920s when a Polish guard was taken prisoner by the Bolsheviks on the other side of the border. So what Kuntrin did is he took a crew of men over, kidnapped the local border guards, brought them back across to the Polish side, and then called the guys on the other side and told them that, we want our guy back. So that was the way that he was able to solve that situation. But unfortunately, these were things that the Soviets ended up finding out about. So they had a special desire to go after people who fought against the Soviets in the 1920 war and also operated in counterintelligence capacities against the Soviets before World War II. Another person very well known in Poland is Witold Pilecki. The most well-known aspect of his career was that he volunteered to enter into the Auschwitz concentration camp as a prisoner to assess the situation and report back to the Polish Home Army. He also ultimately fought in the Warsaw Uprising, left the country after the war, but then decided to return to Poland to continue the struggle against the communists, and ultimately was tried. This is a picture from his show trial, after which he was ultimately executed. This is a book I highly recommend, which is the translation of his report from Auschwitz. He was able to escape the camp and then continue on in his work. But his report has been translated into English, so this is now available on Amazon. I highly recommend it. A few pictures here of the exhumations. There's actually one of the main places in Warsaw is the Powązki Cemetery, and there is a section of the cemetery which was for a long time was used as a kind of a garbage dump. But this is where the communists ended up burying their victims, and it's finally just in the last few years that they've gone through the process of exhuming these remains and conducting DNA testing using DNA from descendants of these people and actually identifying them. So even though it is tragic in the sense that they were killed, at least that honor and memory is being returned in that a real state funeral can occur and they can get the justice in a certain way that they deserve. Another photo here. On to more pleasant subject matter, we have Warsaw today. So the subject of the talk overall is Poland today, but since my experience has been living in Warsaw, I wanted to say a few things about the Polish capital. Here I am meeting the president or mayor of Warsaw, Hanna Gronkiewicz-Waltz. This is in my capacity as a Warsaw Uprising volunteer. This was an event that closed the 70th anniversary commemorations in Warsaw, and I had a chance to talk to her. Actually, I told her about my research and Herbert Hoover and American Aid and all of these things, so it was a nice coincidence. Here's a view of downtown Warsaw. This building here is known as the Palace of Culture. It was a gift, quote unquote, from Stalin after the war, and there are similar buildings in Kiev and also in Moscow. So this is the central part of the city. You can see the modern skyscrapers popping up as well. 1.72 million residents, and even though there are many people who live there, it really doesn't feel like a huge city like you have here in the U.S. I mean, I wouldn't compare it. Population-wise, I think it's closer to Phoenix than anything. So it's a relatively peaceful city, a safe city, and I'm glad that I live downtown where I can walk just about anywhere. So not only is it healthy, but I get to see all different aspects of the city. Warsaw has so far only one metro line, a north-south metro line, but they are building an east-west line, which is just about ready to be completed. Public transportation is excellent in the city, and this has also been a benefit from joining the EU, since billions of euros have been invested in the form of both loans and also investment money from the European Union to advance Poland's infrastructure. This is the Woodrow Wilson Square station in Warsaw. I mentioned that the 25th anniversary of the elections and the Solidarity victory was this past June, so the presidential palace was decorated in this way. Here you have the famous poster of Gary Cooper from High Noon, but instead of a gun in his hand, he has a piece of paper that says elections, and the text that isn't mentioned here, but it's on the original poster, is High Noon, June 6, 1989, the date of those elections. So they put this up for the 25th anniversary. And again, the same thing at night. And in the background here, this was September 1st of this year. You have a projection of the Royal Palace in flames, referring to the Nazi attack on Poland September 1st, 1939. So another reflection on Poland's past, which is it's always there in the public consciousness. And a variation on the poster here, Freedom Holiday, June 4th through 6th, 2014. I think this was when I was on my way to go see President Obama's speech. You can see the police along the route there. And this is the Royal Castle today. So it was rebuilt back in the 70s or the 80s. So now the old town is actually returned to its former state since Warsaw was almost totally destroyed by the end of 1944. Another view here. This is the Polish Academy of Sciences. That's where I am getting my PhD. And this is the Church of the Holy Cross, where the heart of Frédéric Chopin is buried. There was a tradition back then to bury the body in one place and the heart in another. So his body is buried in Paris, and his heart is here in Poland. Just opened this year also the Museum of the History of Polish Jews, which was a project also initiated back in 2007. And this is on the area of the former Warsaw Ghetto. And this monument here is the monument to the fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. So that now faces the new museum, which is the largest and most modern museum of its kind, probably in the world. This is the interior hall. So it's meant to evoke kind of the parting of the seas or a huge ship, that kind of a thing. And a few of the display areas. They try to make it very interactive, so there's all kinds of information. It's very visual. They have projectors all over the place. They have the recreation of a temple here. Poland had a very rich history, Jewish history, since Jews immigrated to Poland pretty much from the beginning, and that evolved over the centuries. So Poland's pre-war Jewish population was around 3 million. I think it was probably only comparable to the United States at that point. And this museum is an attempt to revive the memory of that history, which is an integral part of Polish history. So there are groups that come from all over the world to visit this museum and regain the knowledge of the close history between Polish Jews and Poland as a whole. I gave a talk back in June as well at a conference on Jan Karski. Karski was a courier for the Polish underground who traveled a number of times to the west to report on conditions in Poland. He also went inside the Warsaw Ghetto in 1942 to see firsthand what was happening there, and ended up briefing President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in person in Washington in 1943. And since this was in a synagogue, that's why we have the kippah, the head covering, on. And I gave a talk on Karski's role as an acquisitions agent for the Hoover Institution. So right after World War II, Herbert Hoover had heard of Jan Karski. He wrote a well-known book called Story of a Secret State. And for that reason, Hoover decided to hire Karski to become an acquisitions agent for the Hoover Institution. So thanks to Karski, the Hoover Institution right over here at Stanford has the richest collection of Polish historical material outside of Poland. This is the material that came from the Polish government in exile, which was based in London, but after the war lost its recognition and decided to send its records to Hoover, who had a history of helping Poland, rather than to communist-controlled Poland, which had been taken over by the communists at that point. A bit of technical difficulties, pardon me here. Are there any questions while I work through this? Oh, it looks like we have it back. Poland has had a lot of success in the sporting world this past year. Just a few months ago, Poland defeated Germany 2-0 in soccer at the National Stadium in Warsaw. This was just a few months after Germany had won the World Cup, so this is a huge achievement for Poland. Actually, I think it's the first time that they have defeated Germany in regular exhibition play, so that was a very big event in Poland. Kamil Stoch, a ski jumper, Polish ski jumper, won 2 gold medals at the Sochi Olympics. Another great achievement for Poland. And the Polish national volleyball team is also the champion for 2014. And the championships were held in Warsaw as well, so it was another additional bonus for them. So Poles like to live vicariously through their sports teams, and even though there have been many disappointments over the years, it's been an especially good year this year around. This is kind of a small story I just wanted to add here. Wojtek was a bear. He was a small bear cub who was adopted by some Polish forces who were in the Middle East at first, who had gotten out of the Soviet Union and rejoined the Allied forces and fought in Italy as well. And Wojtek was kind of their mascot. So he grew as time went on, and he liked to drink beer, and he liked to eat cigarettes. And he also carried artillery shells, and apparently never dropped an artillery shell. So some entrepreneurs decided to put Wojtek on a beer bottle. So Wojtek beer, also calling back to that World War II history. My father is Maciej Siekierski. He's the curator of the European collection at the Hoover Institution. But here I happened upon a Czesław Siekierski, who is no relation, but it's just a coincidence. And this is a box of tea. And he's a politician, so this is kind of a gift that these politicians would hand out to entice people to vote for them. This totally random. I just ran into someone who was walking their pig in downtown Warsaw. And a film that I highly recommend. Poland has a long history of very good cinema. And this is a film that was just released this year, Jack Strong, which is about a Polish army officer during the communist times who ended up working for the CIA and secretly passed on information about the Soviets' plans for the invasions of Western Europe. So this was a key piece of Cold War history and very well depicted in this film, which I highly recommend. Another very strange occurrence, I think I tend to attract these types of things. This was in the city of Gdańsk, which is by the Baltic Sea, the main port in Poland. And I was there with my father for a conference on Radio Free Europe. The Hoover Institution has the largest collection of Radio Free Europe materials. We were there for this conference in Poland, and we were taking pictures by the historic part of Gdańsk. And I noticed a light in the distance, and the light was getting closer. I thought maybe it was a helicopter or something like that. And I turned around to take some pictures, and all of a sudden I heard a scream from a tourist that was standing by me and a loud buzzing. and all of a sudden I had to move out of the way because I was almost hit by a drone, which smashed into the historic building that I was under and then fell on the ground. So drones have become very popular nowadays, and this was the close encounter of the drone kind, you could say. Here I noticed a bowl that had a sticker on it with a phone number, which said in Polish, "If you find me, please call this number. Thank you." A few minutes later, the operator showed up and collected his drone and his camera and made sure that everyone was okay, and then left. So that was quite an interesting experience there. Let's see about the order here. I also made it to Lublin for that conference that I showed you a picture of, where I went to the Royal Castle in Lublin, where they have recently renovated the interior of this medieval chapel in the castle, showing this great artwork. Well, what else they uncovered is medieval graffiti carved into the sides of the walls with the knights, I guess, who were bored during Mass or whatever. So they would carve different messages and their names with their swords into the walls. And then with my father here at the conference in Gdańsk. Since I have a great interest in history, I just wanted to say a few things about my family history, what got me interested in Poland especially. Back in September of 1939, both of my grandfathers fought in the September campaign against the Nazis. They were officers in the Polish army, and they knew each other before the war started. This is my mom's dad, my grandfather Kazimierz, and he was taken prisoner after his unit ran out of ammunition in southern Poland and was taken to the prisoner of war camp in Murnau, Germany, in Bavaria. So this is his picture from being taken into the camp in 1939. My other grandfather defended one of the bridges in Warsaw, and when that city capitulated, he was also taken prisoner and also ended up in Murnau by coincidence, really. And both my grandfathers were ironically lucky to have been captured by the Nazis and not by the Soviets, because as I mentioned earlier with the Katyn massacre, just about all of the Polish officers who were captured by the Soviets were killed in the East. In April of 1945, American forces liberated Murnau, and there were some dramatic photos that were taken apparently by a prisoner who had gotten a camera into the camp and took pictures of the liberation as it was happening from one of the guard towers of the camp. Here you see an American tank and also a destroyed Gestapo car where there had been a brief firefight right in front of the camp. Here you see German prisoners being led away. And probably the most dramatic photo here, where it looks like it's directly from the guard tower. You have smoke rising from the car, which had just been struck by the tank. And then prisoners here, some running away from the fence, others running towards it. There's also an amazing video that I happened to find on YouTube just about a year ago that an American soldier filmed while Murnau was being liberated. So there's actually a crowd of these cheering soldiers, and somewhere in that crowd are my grandfathers. The day the camp was liberated was April 29th, 1945. April 29th, 1983 is my birthday. So 38 years later, exactly, I was born. Here another view of the old town of Warsaw. And that's where I'll conclude my talk. Here I am in an outdoor military vehicle museum. And here we have a Soviet tank, so I'm there, standing there with my cousin. As George mentioned, my website is researchteacher.com. And if you have any questions or anything, you can get a hold of me through nick@researchteacher.com. I know there's a lot of information, a lot of various things in this presentation, but I wanted to get as much as I could in there, but I welcome any questions that you might have, and thank you very much for your
First
attention.
question from
I very much enjoyed this update on Poland's history. recognition of the Polish input into the Enigma solution. There's a fellow who was in the Palo Alto Rotary with me, who had been in Polish intelligence, who happened to escape before he got captured and killed. He told me that Poland was the first country to actually get a copy of the Enigma machine. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe it was back in July of 1939 when Polish intelligence officers met with their French and British counterparts to hand over their the ciphers for the machines. And I think the machines, they evolved a bit over time, but that was the beginning of breaking down the Enigma machine. And I think there's a quote from Winston Churchill that the war was shortened by at least a year or two, or maybe more, thanks to the breaking of the Enigma codes. So yes, that is true. Yes. We'll go with the microphone.
I understand that Poland has been quite an economic success over the last 20 years. And I wonder if you could comment about that. What qualities in Poland have made it an economic success?
The quality of the labor force. There are a lot of Polish programmers, computer programmers especially, who have found work in Poland from companies that have decided to invest or that have immigrated out. I think Poland had this, it's always been a dynamic place, but it's been limited by geographical factors and its neighbors and that type of thing. But it was just waiting for the opportunity for freedom and for the markets to grow. I'd still qualify its success in that what I mentioned before, where there are several million at least people who have left the country because they weren't able to find work within the country. And I think that goes back to some of the problems with the government and keeping up with the fast pace of change, being open to not over-regulate the industry. But Poland, I think I'm cautiously optimistic about it. It definitely did well to not suffer from the financial crisis. But I think there are also some after effects of that are catching up to Poland. The EU funding has also been a huge benefit to Poland. The problem there is that it's not market-oriented, right? So there are these huge loans that it's to some degree have to be repaid. There are other funds that don't need to be repaid because that's the way the EU is structured, to where countries with a certain economic level will get these infusions of investments. But Poland is definitely a place that has a lot of people eager to work. If they can't find the work in the country, that, as I mentioned, many of them go to places like England, Ireland, Norway. Although there are many people also from places in the EU that come to Poland to find work. I've even heard of people coming from Spain or Italy to work in Poland because of the depressed economic situation in those countries. Yeah.
Want to get in a little bit of controversy. When the communist regimes fell, the countries of Eastern Europe were all terribly short of capital. Now, I think there was probably a lot of German investment in Poland, buying up firms and taking over trade. How has that worked out? How did the Germans and Poles get along? Now, particularly since the borders are controversial.
You know, honestly, I don't have very much information about the investments from Germany into Poland. What I can say about the current relationship is that it's very good and strong. Poland has actually a close relationship with Germany. Many Poles, hundreds of thousands, live in Germany and work in Germany. If not living there on a permanent basis, they come on a seasonal basis to work in Germany and then come back. So I can't tell you very much more about it, but ironically, the relationship now with Germany is great. Unfortunately, the relationship of Poland with Russia is an ongoing source of friction. Yes.
We read that Hungary and some of the other Eastern Bloc countries are having a reversion to a very nationalistic, very conservative political situation. What's happening in Poland there?
It's a situation that's in flux. I mean, there's definitely a nationalistic element on the Polish political scene, but I wouldn't compare it to some of these things like in Greece or Hungary. I think Poles are unified in their desire to maintain their freedom and also to show some form of resistance to what's going on economically and then militarily in the Ukraine. So I don't think that there's really a nationalistic resurgence. There is a certain percentage of the population that's oriented towards conservative parties that are more libertarian, you could say, so a lot more open economically. Socially, Poland is actually it's a majority Catholic country. Ethnically, it's also majority Polish. But in my view, it seems like a relatively tolerant place. There are minorities. There's a large Vietnamese minority, which started during the Vietnam War that emigrated into Poland. There are a variety of groups that cover the entire political spectrum. They've had, gay pride parades in Warsaw, so there is a wide variety of that. I haven't heard of any extremist activity like, hate crimes or things like that. There's this idea, I think, that a lot of people have that there's still a strong anti-Semitism in Poland, but that hasn't been my experience at all. I think anything that happens that's anti-Semitic in Poland is no more common in Poland than it would be in America. Yeah.
You mentioned there were 3 million Jewish people in Poland, about the same as the United States today. How many Jewish people do you think there are now in Poland?
It's hard to give a specific number, but I don't think it numbers more than several thousand people that identify as Jewish. There's been a mix over time, of course, because there were intermarriages and that type of thing. So there are some people who identify in that way, but it's not very many. There were, to my knowledge, somewhere around 100,000 or more Jews who had survived the war who were in Poland. But there were also manipulations, anti-Semitic campaigns also through the government in the 60s, which led to a large emigration of Jews to Israel. But there's a slow resurgence there, given the long history of Jews in Poland. More and more people are at least coming to visit. But as far as people who live there or identify as Jewish, I think it's in the low thousands. Yeah.
Please comment on the new university at Frankfurt Oder, who was designed to link Germany and Poland. Comment on your view of it. It happens that Stanford is heavily involved. The first rector there was a Stanford professor. Please comment.
I really don't know very much about it. Could you tell me a little bit, and I can say a few words? But I'm not familiar with. I've heard the name, but I'm not familiar with its mission. Right here.
When I was growing up, my father, who was the sales representative for Chicago, was invited to, and he stressed this, a Polish wedding. And Chicago, as I have since learned, had deep pockets of different nationalities. And there was, I remember we went to the wedding, and there was a Polish community center and a church, and there were quite a few people. And my dad said something about there were a lot of Polish people living there.
Yeah.
And when you mentioned immigration, you didn't mention the United States. And I wondered, today, do Polish people come here to the United States? And of course, I don't have anybody in Chicago
Yeah.
anymore, so I don't have any idea if there is still a strong Polish
Yeah.
center.
As I understand it, the large Polish population in Chicago goes back to the late 19th century, early 20th century immigrations, and I don't know what the numbers are as far as Poles leaving to go now, but I'm sure it's very small compared to the people that are going to Western Europe. Since now Poland is part of the EU, they can travel freely throughout Europe, and that's what many Poles do, especially younger people who don't have any ties to a particular location or families will go to England for 6 months, work there, maybe as a waiter or a painter, or there's the stereotype of the Polish plumber, maybe true to a certain extent, but that's the main destination. And there's still the ongoing problem with Poles, their ability to get visas to come to the United States. And I think that was part of the reason for Poland's involvement in Iraq, Afghanistan, and these various NATO endeavors is also to incentivize the U.S. to allow a little more freedom. But I think Poles also, to an extent, have shot themselves in the foot, where many people who have come here on a visa have stayed, and that's kind of not a way to incentivize more visas being given to Poles. But like I said, the fact that they're part of the EU now has given them the incentive to go work Western Europe and come back home on an hour-and-a-half plane flight instead of going all the way across the world.
Well, we thank you very much, Nicholas, for